Good morning. Welcome to those of you who are here in attendance today on the campus of Salisbury University. Also to those of you who are viewing us via live stream. Welcome to the Wicomico County Public Hearing of the Maryland Lynching, Truth, and Reconciliation Commission, the hearing to be held here today. My name is Dr. Marshall Stevenson. I'll be serving as your Master of Ceremonies for this historic and memorable event today. At this time, we will hear words of greeting from Mayor Jacob Day in the city of Salisbury.
Saturday. I'm Jake Day, Mayor of Salisbury. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today, but I want you to know that whatever point our nation is on in its trajectory toward acknowledging its past, this small part of America, the city of Salisbury, Maryland, is committed to acknowledging, telling, and atoning for the truth about our past, even when we're not proud of it. Among the steps we've taken to do just that, we've spent much of the last 7 years working to build and restore trust between our police and our community. We've invested heavily in creating safe spaces for young people. We've worked incredibly hard to expand equitable access to fair, affordable housing, vibrant community centers, and support our most vulnerable populations. We've sought to acknowledge the history of racial terror lynchings through the formation of a task force and ultimately the planting of a permanent monument to the 3 victims of racial terror lynching in Wicomico County. Earlier this year, I completed with city senior staff participation in the Just City Mayoral Fellowship as one of 8 mayors that served with the Harvard Graduate School of Design, the Just City Lab, and the U.S. Conference of Mayors to work on plans to make our city more equitable and more just. And we have recently set forth on a path to uncover what more we can and must do to achieve a more equitable city for all. The most recent step on that path was to establish a City Truth and Reconciliation Advisory Committee. The next step, beginning November 3rd, is to appoint the very dedicated Salisbury citizens who will complete the important work of the committee. This cannot happen without frank discussion, for there can be no acknowledged truth without frank discussion, and there can be no reconciliation without the truth. There can be no equity without reconciliation. We have to be brave enough to have a frank discussion about our past to ever achieve true justice. And so, I thank you for your bravery, and I wish you a productive weekend.
This time, I want to recognize the chairman of the commission, Dr. David Fakunle, who will take us into the opening of the ceremonies.
Good morning. It is always an honor and a pleasure to be a part of this historic body, and I truly thank you all for taking the time and energy to be in this space with us. So at this time, I would like to officially call to order this Wicomico County public hearing session of the Maryland Lynching, Truth, and Reconciliation Commission. I am Dr. David Fakunle, and I am honored to serve as chair of this commission. Before we go on, I do want to take a moment and recognize my colleagues on the commission. I will list them in order. By last name, and if you are in attendance with us, please raise your hand so you may be recognized so we can show our gratitude. So I will start first with the Vice Chair, Dr. Charles Chavis. Moving on with David Armenti, Iris Barnes, Simone Barrett-Williams, Nicholas Creary, Roger Davidson, Maya Davis, Tisha Dupree Wilson, Omar Eaton Martinez, Chris Haley, Dr. Kirkland Hall, Elizabeth Hughes, Izetta Mobley, Carl Snowden, Dr. Marshall Stevenson, and Stephanie Seward. And of course, Dr. Nick Creary, how can I be so awesome? And Dr. Iris Barnes, and Dr. Simone Barrett-Williams. So thank you all and to our staff as well, Zanita Hurley, Kristen McFarland, and Stephanie Thompson, without whom we wouldn't even be here right now. So again, I thank you all for the time, the energy, all the effort that goes into these moments that we're creating right now. So I hope that everybody is prepared to participate in this hands-on process, in this unforgettable experience, because we are very much committed to showing how the legislature of the state of Maryland can work for the people of the state of Maryland. Today's hearing will begin with a reading of House Bill 307, followed by a reading of our protocols for conduct and testimony. Following that, we hear the narrative summary of each of the two known victims, Garfield King and Matthew Williams, and an unidentified victim for whom there is some information known. We will also hear both live and previously recorded testimony from descendants and relatives of the victims, witnesses, and possible perpetrators. We will then transition into the phase of the hearing that includes testimony from our expert witnesses. During that time, the commission may also respond with a question after a witness has concluded their testimony. Before we proceed, our partners from Living and Growing have joined us to help create and maintain a safe emotional space for today's hearing to occur. We know that what we are discussing is not easy. We know that what we're discussing can bring back trauma, generational trauma, and we are very mindful of that. So we want this to be a space where people are as comfortable as possible sharing this truth. As important as the truth is, so is healing. And that is part of the tenet of this commission. So we are glad to be joined by Dr. Combs. Dr. Combs, would you please raise your hand and stand up? There you go. Thank you so much for being here. So they will be available throughout the day for anyone who needs their assistance. They will conduct a short debrief exercise prior to our break, and then again after we adjourn the hearing. So at this time, I would like to recognize Madam Assistant Attorney General Kristen McFarland, who will cite the specific state statute that requires this hearing. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you, commissioners. My name is Kristen McFarland. I am an Assistant Attorney General for the state of Maryland, and I represent the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The legislation creating the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission was signed into law in April of 2019. It has since been amended to extend the commission's sunset date from 2022 to 2024. The act states as follows: whereas lynching, or the extra-legal murder of an individual in an act of mob violence, is a violation of the rights to due process and equal protection of the law. And whereas at least 40 African Americans were lynched by white mobs in Maryland between 1854 and 1933. And whereas no person was ever tried, convicted, or otherwise brought to justice for participating in these racially motivated lynchings. And whereas various state, county, and local government entities colluded in the commission of these crimes and conspired to conceal the identities of the parties involved. And whereas these crimes far exceeded any notion of justice, just retribution, or just punishment, but were intended to terrorize African American communities and force them into silence and subservience to the ideology of white supremacy. And whereas no victim's family or community ever received a formal apology or compensation from state, county, or local government entities for the violent loss of their men. And whereas restorative justice requires a full acknowledgement, understanding, and acceptance of the truth before there can be any meaningful reconciliation. Now, therefore, be it enacted by the General Assembly of Maryland that there is a Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The act further provides for commission members consisting of representatives from the Commission on Civil Rights, the State Archives, Maryland Historical Trust, the Commission on African American History and Culture, the Maryland State Conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Great Blacks in Wax Museum, the Maryland Historical Society, the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, the Lily Mae Carroll Jackson Civil Rights Museum, Maryland's 4 historically Black universities, Bowie State University, Coppin State University, Morgan State University, and the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, with 4 public members appointed by the governor. Staff for the commission is provided by Bowie State University in consultation with the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project and by the Office of the Attorney General. The staff member provided by the Office of the Attorney General may issue a subpoena for the attendance of a witness to testify or for the production of documents in connection with any investigation or hearing conducted by the commission. The commission shall hold regional hearings open to the public in areas in which a lynching of an African American by a white mob has been documented. Receive from the public, including those from the families and communities affected by racially motivated lynchings, recommendations for addressing, engaging, and reconciling communities affected by racially motivated lynchings, including the erection of memorial plaques or signage at or near the sites of racially motivated lynchings. And make recommendations for addressing the legacy of lynching that are rooted in the spirit of restorative justice. In the hearings, the commission may research cases of racially motivated lynchings for which there is no documentation, should those cases be brought to the commission's attention, and the involvement of state, county, and local government entities and relevant news media in cases of racially motivated lynching. On September 1st, 2020, the commission submitted an interim report of its findings and recommendations to the governor and to the General Assembly. On or before December 1st, 2023, the commission shall submit a final report of its findings and recommendations to the governor and to the General Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Assistant Attorney General. At this time, I recognize my fellow commissioner, Dr. Iris Barnes, who will explain our code of conduct for the hearing and explain the process for testimonies and public comments. Thank you, Dr. Barnes.
Good morning. The testimony, questions, procedure, and code of conduct is as follows. Members of the public had the opportunity to submit testimony via email to mltrc@maryland.gov prior to today's hearing. During the hearing today, questions and comments from members of the public here in the chamber will be collected by volunteers. Volunteers, please raise your hand. We have one in back there, one up here. So if you have questions, you would submit to those volunteers. You will please provide your name and organization affiliation, if any, and limit your comment or question to no more than 3 sentences. 3 sentences. Questions, comments, as must be limited to the topic of discussion for today's hearing. If your comment or question is off topic, it will not be included in the hearing. Comments, questions, and testimony should be presented with decorum and the respect appropriate for conducting this public hearing. Any comments or questions containing obscene language or language inciting imminent violence will not be addressed, and any live testimony containing such language will end. Finally, please note that members of the media may be present during today's hearing, and as such, public comments, questions, and testimony may be broadcast or printed by news outlets. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Barnes. So at this time, I recognize Ms. Janae Wallace of the Salisbury City Lynching Memorial Task Force to present the history concerning the life and death of victim Garfield King.
Good morning.
Good morning.
The story of Garfield King. On May 21st, 1898, a 22-year-old white man named Herman Kenny was shot near Twiggs Store in the Trap District of Salisbury. Sheriff John DeShield arrested Garfield King, a black man, and put him in the Wicomico County Jail to remain in limbo as Kenny's wounds were treated in Peninsula General Hospital. 72 hours later, Kenny succumbed to his injuries. Shortly after that, his remains were transported to Stansbury Short's home in nearby California, Maryland. On the afternoon of May 25th, Wicomico County State's Attorney Thomas F.J. Ryder gave King an alleged preliminary hearing at Short's residence, just before Kenny's burial in nearby Whitehaven. King then was held in custody to await grand jury proceedings scheduled for the following September. King never lived to stand before a grand jury. The day before his scheduled appearance, the streets of Salisbury were already swirling with rumors of a potential lynching. It seems that for a particular element of the Salisbury community, justice was not swift enough. As the night drew to close, squads of invisible men gathered on the courthouse green in front of the jail where King was being held, preparing for a ritual that the town of Salisbury had not yet witnessed, which historian Donald Matthews later named the Southern Rite of Human Sacrifice. The growing mob put out the electric lights that hung on nearby poles. Just before the clock struck midnight, shots rang out in the direction of the jail. It had rained earlier, and the crowd of more than 150 were waiting patiently for their leader so that the ritual could begin. They wore what amounted to a uniform of gum boots, oilskin coats, and oilskin hats. A hurrah rang out from the mob as their leader arrived. The mob leader wasted no time. He approached Sheriff DeShield and demanded that he hand over the keys to King's jail cell. DeShield refused to give up the keys, so the leader ordered his men to find a telephone pole. Shortly after, 30 men approached the jail carrying a telephone pole and used it to batter their way inside. They headed up the stairs to King's cell. Out of nowhere, a masked ruffian emerged with an axe and broke the lock holding King in the cell, and he was dragged out onto the street. As King was pulled from his cell, the mob cried, "A rope! A rope!" Shortly after, local attorney E. Stanley Tobin, accompanied by other citizens, appeared on the scene, begging the mob to return King to the sheriff's custody. The crowd ignored Tobin and the other residents and began preparing a noose. And they did so. As they did so, King kicked and pleaded for the mob to let him loose. King was beaten, kicked, and dragged from the foot of the jailhouse stairs to the jailhouse yard. Members of the mob fixed the rope to his neck and lifted him over the branch of a young maple tree. Immediately, the rope snapped and King fell to the ground. As he lay there, still alive, someone fired a shot into him. The mob quickly adjusted the rope, and King was once again lifted into the tree. As King hung suspended in the air, the leader yelled, "Line up, boys," to the crowd at the side of the jail. The men formed a firing squad, shooting more than 100 bullets into King's suspended body. The mob cheered with excitement as they participated in this Southern amusement. Then, like troops, the men fell into formation and marched away. Among the witnesses to King's murder was Salisbury local A.F. Benjamin, who arrived just as the ritual began around 12:35 to 12:50 a.m. Engaged in this community affair, the mob wore no mask and called each other by name. Among the emboldened crowd were fishermen who worked along the Wicomico River and other leading citizens of the community. The Baltimore Sun had been given notice that the lynching was going to occur and sent a correspondent to the scene where he spoke to the mob leaders. Expressing their devotion, they told the reporter, "We would have accomplished it had we waded through blood to our necks." Holland, the local judge, was suddenly awakened by the shots that had been fired. When he arrived at the scene, King's lifeless body was still dangling in the air, riddled with more than 100 bullets. Unfortunately, the spectacle would continue. Holland ordered King's body to be taken down and placed in the nearby engine house for protection until burial arrangements were made. By morning, this makeshift mortuary had transformed into a gallery, and King's mutilated body was the featured exhibition. Hundreds of people made their way to the engine house to view the work of Southern savagery. They marveled at the sight of the young, well-built mulatto teenager, a recent graduate of Princess Anne Academy, now the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, whose bloodied and mangled body seemed to be held together by only a thin shirt and a pair of black stockings. The gunshots had cut holes in King's chest and face, blowing away the upper part of his shirt. By the afternoon, the exhibition had ended, and the town undertaker, George C. Hill, wrapped King's mutilated and exploited body in a winding sheet and placed him in a coffin. King was finally laid to rest in a cemetery just beyond the New York, Philadelphia, and Norfolk Railroad. On May 31st, the so-called Negro community of Salisbury and Wicomico County packed into the John Wesley Methodist Episcopal Church to condemn the lynching of Garfield Brown. The meeting was attended by black leaders from across the state, including prominent banker Solomon T. Huston of Salisbury, who was chosen as chairman. Other speakers included the church's senior pastor, Reverend F.C. Wright, and Reverend A.R. Stokely, F.N. Butler, Jace O. Pinkett, and Huston. Each of the speakers condemned the deplorable act while cautioning the black citizens to keep calm and remain law-abiding. Before the meeting came to a close, a committee was appointed to reach out to Maryland Republican Governor Lloyd Lowndes Jr., calling on him to offer a $1,000 reward to anyone who could identify those involved in the lynching. The committee included notable Baltimore civil rights attorney William Ashby Hawkins, Robert Patterson Graham, a Salisbury native and future Secretary of State Huston, and J.F. Gaddis of Wicomico County. Following the Select Committee's formation, Wicomico County State's attorneys summoned over 50 witnesses before a coroner's jury to give testimony into the lynching of Garfield King. Among the group of witnesses was former Democratic State Senator of Wicomico County, Edward Stanley Todman. Todman, an eyewitness, claimed that he entered into the jail as soon as the mob broke in, hoping to reason with them and also to protect 4 of his other Negro clients who were in the cell besides King. In the end, Tobin claimed that he was unable to identify any member of the mob due to the lack of lighting and the fact that many of the men had their faces blackened and covered with red paint. Tobin describes a scene similar to the scenes of other lynching cases on and off Maryland's Eastern Shore, where mobs' faces were described as being painted black. Other witnesses confirmed the testimony of Tobin with one exception. They identified the leader of the mob as being a tall and slender man who allegedly fit the description of the mob leader identified in previous lynchings in nearby Somerset and Caroline counties. Another vital detail obtained from the statement is the level of organization that was exemplified in the act. This is evidenced within, and I quote, the promptness and business-like way in which the tall leader directed things in Salisbury Wednesday night would suggest that he had experience in such things before. The reporter continued raising the question, have we a gang of organized lynchers on the Eastern Shore? Shortly after the coroner's jury's investigation, the interracial delegation made their way to Annapolis to confront the governor. On Friday, June 18th, around 9 o'clock, Governor Lloyd Lowndes Jr. arrived at the offices located at the Merchants National Bank building, accompanied by Major General Lemuel Allison Wilmer and Secretary of State Richard Dallam, only to find a delegation of black men along with Graham waiting to confront him regarding the lynching of King. In addition to the original members of the delegation, the group was joined by several black religious leaders, including future U.S. Ambassador to Liberia, Reverend Dr. Ernest Lyon of John Wesley Methodist Church, who served as the group's spokesman, Reverend John Norris of Ebenezer African Methodist Episcopal Church, Reverend E.F. Eccleston of Grace Presbyterian Church, and future Baltimore City Councilman Hiram Waddy. Collectively, the group urged Governor Lowndes to provide a reward for information leading to the arrest of those responsible for lynching King. In response, Houston makes an astonishing statement, stating that many of the lynchers were from the Trap District in Wicomico County. Graham took it a step further, confessing that King's lynching was deprecated by the better class of citizens. To no surprise, Governor Lowndes expressed reluctance regarding offering an award to assist in identifying the mob, citing that such a measure had been ineffective in the past. Nonetheless, Governor Lowndes said that he would consider the request and expressed confidence that at least some of those responsible for King's lynching would be brought to justice.
Thank you, Ms. Wallace, for telling that story. So at this time, we will recognize two descendants of Garfield King. Okay, got you. Two descendants of Garfield King, and hear testimony from Ms. Latanya Christopher, followed by Ms. Cynthia King Polk. Thank you for being here.
Change will not come if we wait for some other person or if we wait for some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek. Barack Obama. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for taking time out of your day to attend this very important hearing to learn about Eastern Shore's lynching history and heinous acts of violence on Black human beings, and about what has been done and why we can no longer be silent. James Garfield King was 18 years old and had recently graduated from the Princess Anne Colored Academy. His whole life was taken in such a gruesome manner. He never had the opportunity to have children because his life had just started. His life mattered then, and his life matters today. We will no longer be silent about what happened to him and who were involved in his lynching. My family, the King family, were terrorized, and the fear lasted for generations and generations. But today, I stand here as the granddaughter of Mary King, whose father was Naaman King, whose father was Scott King, and James Garfield King was the brother of Scott King, my great-great-grandfather. And I will no longer allow my ancestors to be forgotten. I also have a speech of a cousin. His name is Julian Collins. My name is Julian Collins, and I am a proud descendant of Garfield King, who was a highly regarded citizen of Trap District, Allen, Maryland, and a graduate of University of Maryland Eastern Shore, formerly known as the Princess Anne Academy. Garfield King was my great-great-uncle and the younger brother to my great-great-grandmother, Minerva King Wright. The Kings were one of the first Black prominent families to settle in Trap District, Maryland. The King family also contributed to the social and economic success of Trap District by becoming college graduates, religious leaders, educators, veterans, entrepreneurs, political leaders, history makers, and law-abiding citizens. Unfortunately, they could not enjoy the fruits of their labor due to racial inequalities and white supremacy. During the end of the Civil War and birth of the Reconstruction era, Black families were marginalized and targeted by white supremacists for being educated and given equal rights. This inconvenient truth became a reality for the King family when Garfield was murdered and lynched in 1898. An act of self-defense during a disagreement with a white resident resulted in a guilty before proven innocent conviction by law enforcement and the demise of Garfield King. Garfield became the first documented lynching in Salisbury, Wicomico, Maryland, when he was kidnapped from his jail cell and violently mutilated by white supremacists. He did not receive a proper burial or a conviction for his murder. My great-great-great-grandfather, Nathaniel King, who was Garfield's father, did not show up to confirm his identity due to a possibility that he would receive the same treatment of his son, as his son. Garfield had a promising future that was interrupted by the atrocities of racism in America. He was disrespected in life and in death. No one was convicted of his murder, and law enforcement became silent about hate crimes against Black citizens. Fortunately, we are able to bring Garfield King and other victims justice today by raising awareness about lynchings in America and by confronting the dark history that politicians are currently trying to avoid. In conclusion, I want to thank the Equal Justice Initiative for commemorating our ancestors with a memorial plaque in downtown Salisbury. I also want to thank Wicomico Truth and Reconciliation Initiative for keeping the public well informed about our history and raising awareness in the community. Thank you, Dr. Charles Chavis, Jr., for your remarkable research in unveiling the silent history of lynchings in Maryland. I would like to thank the state commissioners for being a catalyst for change and creating a process of accountability. Last but not least, I would like to thank the King family and all the descendants, past and present, for the amazing genealogy research projects we are doing. Special thanks to my cousin Latanya Christopher, Irwin Polk, and for preserving our family's history in Allen, Maryland, and for keeping our ancestors' legacy alive 124 years later. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Cynthia King Polk. Again, I want to welcome Wicomico's public hearing, the State of Maryland's Lynching True and Reconciliation Commission, the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race, and Wicomico Truth and Reconciliation Initiative, the family of the descendants, distinguished guests, and friends. I am a descendant of James Garfield King, who was lynched and died in 1898 in Wicomico County, Maryland. He was lynched on the courthouse lawn with a white violent mob. This is the same courthouse that when I was a little girl, I would read the sign that said, "No coloreds drink from this water fountain." Now, how are we descendants? I am the daughter of Mary King Christopher. Mary was the daughter of Naaman Webster King. Naaman King was the son of Scott King, and Scott King was the brother of James Garfield King, who was the victim of this dreadful lynching. Garfield King had other siblings. I'm just going to mention one, which was Alice King Polk, who was the mother of Thomas Polk, who we know as the great Buffalo Soldier. Our family did not stop being a model citizen because of our experiences. Instead, we learned to prove how loyal we were as a family. However, we carried this pain around for generations. As John Bowen, quote from him, it says, "The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways. And the history is literally present in all that we do." Thank you.
Our gratitude to Ms. Christopher and Ms. King Pope for telling your story and allowing us to honor your ancestor. We only hope that we do our best to preserve his legacy and to tell the full truth, not just of his tragic death, but of his life. And as you said, Latanya, a life that was just beginning. I hope we all think about where we were at 18 years old. I know where I was. And to think that would be the end of it. Let's be mindful of perspective as we hear these stories. The opportunities lost. So being mindful of all that we have heard about James Garfield King, and in preparation to discuss our next known racial terror lynching victim, we're going to take a 5-minute break. So at this time, I would like to recognize the Vice Chair of the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Dr. Charles Chavis, to present the history concerning the life and death of our other known victim, Matthew Williams, as well as our currently unidentified victim. Thank you, Dr. Chavis.
Again, I want to thank everyone for coming out today for this historic moment where we are sharing the truth and moving towards justice. I'm indebted to Miss Tracy Jeannie Jones, the descendant of Matthew Williams, who has been alongside this journey with me as we've sought out to uncover what happened to her loved one. I have about 30 to 40 minutes to share some of the brief information that I've obtained in the course of my research of over 6 years investigating the case of Matthew Williams, the lynching of Matthew Williams, unmasking the individuals behind the lynching, including local law enforcement, state officials. And so with that, I'll begin with a short film that we are producing with the support of Humanity United and George Mason University and a number of other organizations to share this story with the world and the national audience. And so I'll start with that. This gives a brief introduction into the story of Matthew Williams with some living individuals who were alive at the time, just babies at the time, but their families, were survivors of the racial terror that ensued the night of the lynching. And so we'll start there, and then from there I'll work through some of the selected investigation materials, actual evidence and documents that I'll be showing for the first time to the public of the names of individuals whose families some families are still around to this day who were indeed involved in this lynching. And so I'll transfer to that shortly thereafter. So at this time I'll play the video, and it's about 7 minutes and 22 seconds, and then we'll transition into the formal presentation.
I would say about a little past Walnut Street. All on one side of the street were black people, families. And all on the other side of Poplar Hill Avenue were white. But everybody Everybody got along good. Children, if they had children, we played together. We didn't go to school together, but we played together. That was our environment that we had to live in. Everybody still had to try to get along with each other, regardless to what had happened.
I had no clue when I stumbled on those boxes at the Maryland State Archives that I would uncover a story that impacted a community such as this.
I heard about it through someone who was looking at archives in the Somerset Herald, where I used to work. It's one of the oldest papers in the state of Maryland. And the girl was doing a piece on the lynching. And then that's when I started questioning some of the family members that I thought knew about it. So I think that it was tragic. Blacks did not talk about it at all. All the articles in the Somerset County paper were deleted. You didn't find any record of that. So I think the Black community was just scared. I think they felt that they didn't have a voice, couldn't fight the system. They controlled everything. They basically controlled the Black community. In that sense, you better not speak up.
This is the building right here, Wicomico Hotel, across the street from where Matthew Williams was lynched. We know that there was so much activity at the hotel that was going on the night of the lynching. We know that there was a football game in town. There was two teams, rival teams from the area in town. And so there were thousands of people here. And what we don't oftentimes discover is that there were Black workers here who saw their classmate, their friend, a member of their community being lynched.
Everybody had to stay in. We had to stay in the house. You could not go out.
One journalist who braved the racial terror of the day was Paul Henderson of the Baltimore Afro-American. And because of Paul Henderson, we have actual evidence from the actual lynching and the rope that is referenced in the witness accounts. The rope that Chief Greer provided the mob for Williams to be lynched with is actually on display at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, this oil-soaked rope. And based on the historical photographs, the lynching would have taken place right around this area. A Pinkerton detective agent, who we now know walked these streets in Salisbury, as Patsy Johnson. Because of his journal, his daily accounts, we know who the members of the mob were. On this ground that we stand is the actual marker that was dedicated to Matthew Williams by the Equal Justice Initiative and the Lynching Memorial Task Force, which I've had the honor to work alongside the Salisbury Lynching Memorial Task Force. If we're brave enough, as this community has been, to confront this history, to deal with this history, to wrestle with it, to sit in it, then we can all realize justice and hopefully equality. Thank you. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint now. Wow. And so at this time, I want to kind of transition. In the film, you saw that I mentioned the boxes that I discovered in the Maryland State Archives. And these were a part of an unprocessed collection of records that I discovered while I was a doctoral student at the Morgan State University. And I'm honored to have Dr. Earl Richardson here, a mentor of mine who served as president of Morgan State University for 26 years. And I would not have had funding or support without working in his office and under his leadership at the Robert M. Bell Center for Civil Rights and Education at Morgan State. With that support, I was able to spend some time in the archives to do some digging about this specific case, and I'm honored for that. And thankful for that opportunity. I feel that I would not have been able to do this without the education I received at a historically black college and university. I have to acknowledge that as we begin. And so from there, as a doctoral student, I sought out to dispel this myth associated with racial terror lynchings throughout U.S. history that lynchings took place at the hands of persons unknown. This lie that is constantly always allowed to live, that somehow invisible mobs of ghosts in many ways come into these communities and destroy black life and black communities. I sought out to dispel that myth, and this myth in this specific case, because most of the focus in Maryland is specifically on the case of George Armwood, who we'll hear about his case in Somerset County in their hearing next week. But I wanted to get to the root of what I believed was a consistent trend that we've seen in U.S. history regarding the direct correlation between economic violence and economic upheaval and the uptick in racial terror and racial violence. And so as a historian, we see that the nadir, post-Reconstruction, or the nadir of race relations in this country at the turn of the century, where we're having economic turmoil, there's oftentimes a rise, right, in cases of racial terror lynching. And so if we're to understand what happened to George Armwood, then we have to move closer to the Great Depression and move a little bit earlier to 1929 and also to 31, which is when Matthew Williams was lynched. And as a result of that, I began to do a dive and to really try to salvage the humanity in this story and to identify anything that I could find. And it was at this time, I believe, I'm a man of faith, and so I believe the ancestors and God led these boxes directly to me. I discovered boxes of records that included the investigation, and to be clear as well, these are all state records. There were records underneath unpublished records, unprocessed records within the state archives that have been hidden in full view for over 90 years. And they included eyewitness statements from individuals, law enforcement officials, as well as the daily journal of a Pinkerton detective agent who was hired by the governor and then Attorney General Preston Lane. And we also had undercover Baltimore detectives and agents who were also doing an investigation as well. And so this presentation will focus specifically on the information that was gleaned from those investigations. But I also want to make sure to underscore that Albert Ritchie recognized that there was a need for two investigations. And so there was a public investigation which was publicized. In fact, as Albert Ritchie was on his campaign to hopefully secure the presidency and contend with FDR, he was in a black community in Chicago. And the lynching, he got news of the lynching, and he sent out a telegram responding, saying emphatically that he was going to get to the bottom of this and investigate this thoroughly. And directly there, after that, he telegrammed to Attorney General at the time to investigate the lynching. And so we see that publicized in newspapers. And so there's two investigations. There's a public investigation that is publicized within the Baltimore Sun, the Afro, and locally. However, what I identified in the materials was the parallel investigation that Preston Lane and the governor did not inform the then state's attorney, Claude Levin Bailey, about any of what was going on. So he had two investigations. And I believe, and based on the evidence that I've seen, that this is because he knew that the state's attorney as well as the judge were both culpable and complicit in the lynching, if not directly involved in the lynching of Matthew Williams. And as we went through the materials, that continued, as I went through the records, that evidence came to fore. And so, top secret investigation. And in those documents, we actually have the note from Preston Lane to the superintendent of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which is a private agency that actually was established. And I told myself I wasn't going to go into the history and give my students are here. I'm not going to lecture. But I need to provide context regarding the Pinkertons. And so the Pinkertons were a private detective agency established by an agent who actually was the individual who stopped the first assassination plot of Abraham Lincoln. So they've been around for a while. And Governor Ritchie uses the Pinkertons to infiltrate the mob. And so he sends them undercover into Salisbury, into this very community, directly after the lynching. And so around December 10th, the agent arrives in town under his undercover. And this agent is Patsy Johnson. And so I discovered, one of the materials I discovered as well was a journal, 3 months, daily account of Patsy Johnson. Patsy Johnson's identity was not revealed in this journal. I had to decode his journal to obtain his identity. So based on the documents and the protocol of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, all of the identities of their agents are in secret within all of their documentation. And so the first thing that I had to do was to identify the individual, and I had to decode that. And I identified this individual as one Patsy Johnson, who was a retired boxer who had a few fights on the Eastern Shore, however, but was at the end of his career and ended up getting picked up and employed by the Pinkertons. And so he arrives in Salisbury shortly after the lynching, and he obtains confessions from those directly involved. And all of his records are documented in the documents that I've obtained. And so here you will see a list of the witnesses, which I want to make sure, which is very important. And so this is the actual list of all of the witnesses that were called. This list is actually published in the Baltimore Sun, as well as the Afro-American, of the over 140 witnesses that are called. I've highlighted select witnesses because those individuals are individuals whose names show up in the investigation documents, and those individuals who are culpable, complicit, or directly involved in the lynching. I also highlighted law enforcement officers as well, who represent the Sheriff's Department, the Chief of the Salisbury City Police, as well as the Salisbury Fire Department, which is ironically celebrating its 150th anniversary today. And just to go through some of these names, the sheriff at the time, Donald Anthony Parks, we actually had the unique opportunity to interview the son of Mr. Will or Bill Adis, who is very prominent and people may know him in this community. His father shows up in our records. We interviewed him about that. We also have information on, as well, as I mentioned, Sheriff Murray Phillips, Chief Nicholas Holland. But I also want to talk about two specific individuals, and these are the black witnesses or eyewitnesses who serve as the two of the main individuals, the only black individuals to cooperate with the state. And those two individuals are Dr. A.D. Brown, and you see his name there highlighted, but also on the second page, you'll see one Maslin Pinkett, who is actually a professor at UMES during this, but he also serves as a bellhop at the Wicomico Hotel at the time. And ironically, over the course of doing research and hiring genealogists, we were able to determine that Mr. Maslin Pinkett is actually the great-grandfather of Jada Pinkett Smith, and her family has been notified of that, their connection to this case, and have been provided with all the evidence concerning their loved one. And so from here, I want to focus on Dr. A.D. Brown first. And please excuse these graphics, but they speak to what the terror and the consistent trauma that blacks went through during this time, but specifically Dr. A.D. Brown, who is, again, one of the main individuals who is participating, and he is cooperating with the state, and he's naming names, right? And so this whole, one thing that I wanted to push back against as well is this black silence, that blacks were so scared to speak up. And this is one of the things that I think is also important as we look at this assault that we're seeing on truth-telling in our schools and history, right? If we erase history and don't talk about this, we overlook the heroes who stood on the right side of history, regardless of whether they were black and white, and did what was right, if we erase everything and don't talk about it. And Dr. A.D. Brown is one of those individuals whose legacy would get lumped up in this black fear, right? So his statements, a 40-page statement, of which we have copies of for members of the media, and if you get a card from my assistant, Mr. Kairaba Toure, he'll provide those copies. It's a 40-page document detailing Dr. Brown's statement to the Attorney General, and so he's naming names. Also, what's really interesting about Dr. Brown is that he just couldn't escape Salisbury. So, being born in Salisbury, North Carolina, attended Livingstone College. In the statements, you'll see here at the top, he reminds State's Attorney, the office, not State's Attorney, but he reminds he reminds the Attorney General that this is not the first time he's witnessed a lynching. He's very familiar with how mobs function, and I'll let you see the quote, and I'll have my clicker here as well if I can figure out how to, okay. But you'll see here where he's talking about his experiences, and these are directly from the documents, right? Also, the earlier point I made about Judge Bailey and Claude Bailey, or Levin C. Bailey, whose namesake, the firm was downtown most recently, Bailey and Hearn. This individual here, you'll see that it's interesting, I thought, in looking at Dr. Brown's statement, that Preston Lane asked him about the involvement of Judge Bailey and of Claude Bailey, who's actually the nephew. So the judge who's over the grand jury hearing proceedings is actually the nephew of the state's attorney, right? Professor Sherilyn Eiffel reveals that in her book, and that's a footnote, something that is a major contribution that was beneficial to this analysis as well. And then lastly here, you see where he's naming an individual by name. And so this idea that, again, blacks are so fearful they're not speaking out is just not true. We see individuals like Dr. Brown who risk their lives to speak out against this racial terror, and I wanted to honor him, but also provide, and again, the state had all of these records, and so did the Attorney General. So this is one Maslin Pinkett, and I'm thankful for Dr. Marshall Stevenson for being here and supporting some of the research and obtaining more evidence and information about Maslin Pinkett. Maslin Pinkett is interviewed by the Baltimore undercover detectives who are going through the areas of Princess Anne and following the leads of Patsy Johnson. So what's happening in the case is Patsy Johnson is reporting his weekly journals directly to Lane as well as his superintendents in Philadelphia. And based on my research, I was able to determine that he is providing places for identities of individuals so that the Baltimore undercover agents can follow up, right? So they're doing this in real time. It's a parallel to undercover investigation. And so he sends him to identify and connect with Maslin Pinkett. The two sergeants are Sergeant Martin and Ware of the Baltimore Police Department, and they are actually underneath the state's authority and direction. At that time, Baltimore City was underneath, the police department was underneath the state police department. And so Baltimore agents came in town and they connected with Maslin. And this is where Maslin And I'll just read directly from, this is actually from my book. Pinkett was the first witness to name Fats Wilson, Harrington, and Webster as individuals who had been at the center of the conspiracy, men responsible for abducting and subsequently lynching Williams. Wilson and Webster's roles in the mob's action would later be corroborated by eyewitnesses Patsy interviewed. And so you have eyewitnesses who are corroborating what Mr. Pinkett is sharing, or excuse me, Professor Pinkett, who, as I mentioned, was a professor of mathematics by day and a bellman at night at the Wicomico Hotel. And he's one of the two main witnesses who are providing insight into exactly what is happening. And in this section, I want to transition into the law enforcement. And this is a quote that Professor Sherilyn Eichel uses to describe what she witnesses and identifies through the Afro-American newspaper and other research that she's done with oral historians. But I'm taking that and I'm looking at these documents to examine critically the ways in which the law enforcement and institutions that are supposed to protect and serve are involved in these cases, right? And this is a photograph, courtesy of the NAB Center, of some of the officers who were on the scene and whose reports we obtained in the course of our investigation, including the Chief of Police, Nicholas Holland, who was identified as one of the members of the mob. Before we get to Chief Holland, again, I want to focus specifically on the courts, right? You have the judge, as I mentioned, Joseph Bailey, who's over the case, and his nephew, Levin C. Bailey. This is the evidence that we've obtained through Patsy Johnson and others who were actually in the room whenever the grand jury hearing was happening. One of the struggles that we've had as a commission is to obtain grand jury information regarding grand jury proceedings. But the evidence, in addition to the other evidence that we received in terms of statements, I discovered, handwritten notes from those proceedings from the Attorney General. And in those notes, Maslin Pinkett is highlighted in all of the activities that Patsy Johnson observes as a witness, because his name ends up on the witness list, as well as what I've later discovered were other Pinkerton detective agents who were also in the room. And so originally, I thought that it was only Patsy who was hired. But after obtaining the actual invoice from the Pinkertons, because they have to get paid, at which you saw the rates and the funds for how much it cost a day, there were multiple agents who were also in the room that no one knew about. And they also provided their reports, and this is what they discovered. It seemed like, and what it was being observed, Bailey was going, Good. Can you hear me now? Good. That was right when we was getting to the juicy. Okay. Can you hear me? Now? Let me just hold it. So, hello? Okay, perfect. Right on there. Okay, so Patsy recorded the unethical and illegal and unconstitutional practices that he noticed during the first day of the proceedings, describing the scene as a farce. While the grand jury was hearing testimony, State's Attorney Levin Bailey went in and out of the jury room 5 or 6 times as Judge Bailey was holding court. Around the third time Bailey left the jury room, he walked to the former mayor, Kernley, and whispered something in his former mayor's ear. Bailey then headed back into the jury room, and Kernley said to the crowd on the stairwell, "Oh, somebody has been in the jury room already. I kind of thought someone would spill the beans." And so what we saw here is literally the state's attorney is going in and out, reporting to members of the mob what is being said to make sure that everybody's story's straight as they are called to be witnessed. And this, again, is the state's attorney for Wicomico County, Levin C. Bailey. Also, the individual who appears in the records is Chief Fred A. Greer of Salisbury Fire Department. And I mentioned this in the film, but a number of witnesses, and I want to say this as well, I highlighted 2 witnesses that were black. All of the evidence returning to law enforcement's involvement are corroborated and substantiated by all white witnesses, right? And so white witnesses who are a part of the mob identify the chief of police as providing the rope to lynch Matthew Williams. And here you'll see a quote from one of those individuals, Harry Waller. And in this quote, you see here that Greer has provided the rope. And I'm not going to read that. Everyone can see it. Can you see it, or should I read it for the record? Read it. Why, even the chief of police, Holland, would not squeal on the men, and he knows who they are. Why, damn it, some good friends of Captain Greer, who is the head of the fire department, asked the captain if they could have some rope to hang the nigger with. And Captain Greer said, sure, come on in, and I'll give you all you want. And this is from one Harry Waller, who was an individual who also confessed directly to Patsy Johnson to lynching Matthew Williams. We also have a quote that I wanted to highlight from a law enforcement officer, Broughton, that speaks to this legacy of black dehumanization in regards to how we, I believe, approach and understand the relationship between black communities and police communities. That's really, in many ways, parallel to what we see with the treatment of black bodies and black individuals. Specifically, we can talk about Michael Brown, but George Floyd, right, and the ways in which the institutionalization of anti-black violence manifests itself. While being interviewed by the Attorney General, this officer was asked, what were you doing and what's going on? And he said that, why were you not doing anything, et cetera, et cetera? And you see here in the quote, he says that I decided to direct traffic as I thought that was the most humane thing to do. It reminds me of what potentially the officers who stood by as George Floyd was being choked, as if they were guarding the scene. These are the same type of practices that we have to call into question that continue to manifest themselves and that can be drawn directly from these cases such as these to the cases that we're witnessing continue in this country. At the end of the investigation, which was around March, because they're preparing for the grand jury proceeding, and so the Pinkertons have to deliver what they found, in time for Preston Lane and others to be able to present this and to investigate and close out this investigation and decide what to do. And in that, we see the summaries of the involvement. And you'll see here those individuals that are named, again, Chief of Police Holland, and you see here Talbot Longmore, who's again white, Sid Church, white, Rufus Perry, white. All of these are white individuals who are naming the chief of police as being directly involved. Here it says, Talbot Longmore said Holland and Sheriff Parks were among the leaders to get the Negro out of the hospital. Prominent men told these two men their plan for the proposed lynching, right? Here you see Murray Phillips, who is in the sheriff's department. Talbot Longmore, again, said a man he observed at fights, and he said that Murray Phillips, had Williams by the leg, and Murray Phillips had him by the other leg, right? So this is, all of this is being corroborated. Another individual here, I think it's in this one here, you'll see Elwood Waller, who ended up, based on our research, becoming a prominent member of the fire department. He confesses directly to Patsy Johnson, to pouring the gasoline, 5 gallons, on Matthew Williams. And his photograph is within the Salisbury Fire Department Museum, as he would eventually serve as a firefighter and the head of that department. As well as you see here, Sheriff of Laurel County, Delaware. So there was a lot of law enforcement involved in this specific case. And here you see the Sheriff of Laurel County, Delaware, whose name appears here at the bottom. And this is actually not only, we see it in this document, but this is, so we have it directly from witnesses, but we also have this that was published in the Afro-American as well. And this is just, again, Fire Chief Greer. You have 2 individuals who are corroborating what was already previously outlined. And again, all of the copies of these documents will be made available. Okay. In conclusion, as I conclude, and I'm okay on time, Stephanie? Great. And this map, and I'm thankful to members of my research team for pulling all this together. In the end of my book, I develop a chart using a model that Howard Smead uses in his research on the Mac Charles Parker lynching in Mississippi, where he lays out these circles of the conspiracy, these circles and layers. And this theory or framework was very beneficial as I sought out to make sense of where people fit in this. And you'll see here the first circle on the right. These are the individuals who were directly involved in this lynching, directly responsible for the act, who put their hands on the body, who were directly involved. And you see here members of law enforcement as well as others who were members of the community. And there are 5, in fact, specific circles: direct conspirators, co-conspirators, those who were planners, right? Because what we know that lynchings were not sporadic, they were planned. And even with the Garfield King case, we hear about the pre-planning of this. The Baltimore Sun had time to send people to report. That means that people knew ahead of time. This is very consistent with what we know about racial terror lynchings historically throughout the U.S., this pre-planning. That was definitely the case in the case of Matthew Williams. And so you had planning, and you had people who served as lookouts. Also, the third area was no direct role, but they knew and supported the conspiracy, ex post facto knowledge and witnesses, and then at least the passing knowledge. And so I did my best in my book and in this diagram to show the various ways in which individuals find themselves, end up in the course of the investigation. And lastly, I highlighted the institutions, which I think is very important. And one of the things that Brian Stevenson says, amongst the amazing things that he says in this space around confronting the legacy of racial violence, is that our institutions have to reckon with the ways in which they were directly involved in not only these cases, but perpetuating these myths and this anti-Black violence, right? And we understand that the modern day law enforcement officers and institutions are not involved in cases such as their predecessors were, but they are a part of that legacy. And Black communities who work in relationship to law enforcement and to these institutions, there is a lingering trauma that needs to be recognized in interacting with Black communities by law enforcement and to be understood. And I think one of the things that we have to be able to glean from the work of this commission is that law enforcement and others should learn, and this information that we're obtaining should all be incorporated into training and the ways in which law enforcement and others can understand this history, right? Not just about where some cases where we see here where law enforcement is heavily involved, but also in other cases, because that is what Black communities are bringing to this trauma, these past experiences that oftentimes no one believes. They're bringing this to them when they're engaging with the police. These historic episodes that their family members may have dealt with, right? All of that's coming. So I think we have to be able to utilize this and how we engage with Black communities and communities who've suffered this type of trauma and terror, regardless if there's a direct connection or not. One thing that I think needs to also be understood is that the lynching of Matthew Williams was not just the lynching of an individual. It was the lynching, as I say in my book, of an entire community. As Professor Sherilyn Ifill says, lynchings were message crimes. And as you see, Miss Audrey Matthews in the film discusses what her parents relayed to her about the fear on that night of hiding and running, being told not to go outside. You had African Americans who were running, jumping in the river, individuals who were just running for their lives. It was a night of terror. It was not one targeted incident where the individual was obtained and it was over. The entire Black community was put on notice. And the main objective, I believe, and based on my research, was to destroy and dismantle this historic black business district of Georgetown and the black community. And before I get to the unknown victim, I have one slide for that victim. We were able to obtain 3 primary source documents regarding this individual. I want to talk about the direct correlation between the lynching of Matthew Williams and the destruction of the Georgetown community. Because people oftentimes have asked, how do you get from this to that, right? And originally, most communities can assume, we believe through testimony and anecdotal evidence that there may be some connections. However, I'm thankful for my research team and my students who are doing the work of truth-telling and justice-seeking for obtaining a map of the Georgetown Historic District. And this map is an annotated Sanborn map that was identified in the NAB Center here at Salisbury. And Ian Post, who's not here, was integral in helping identify this map. And this map is an annotated map that's within the files of Richard Hodgkins, who is a wealthy real estate developer in Salisbury at the time. And ironically, as the plot thickens, Richard Hodgkins grew up in the home and is a direct relative of Judge Bailey and the other Baileys. They grew up in the same home. They appear on the same census record. And he commissions a map directly after the lynching of Matthew Williams, naming by name all of the black businesses and homes and residents by name in this annotated map. And he provides values for each home. And my students and our researchers are currently investigating the subsequent destruction of the black community, and we've uncovered those properties were then targeted and purchased and eliminated systemically between the 1930s, 50s, and even into the early 2000s. And we have the ACLU who sent a statement regarding those federal cases that are directly connected to this lynching and to the destruction of this community. Lastly, as I conclude, I wanted to share information about the unknown victim. So outside of what we had obtained in the Baltimore Afro-American regarding this victim, who we believe was a black veteran based on his uniform, his body was discovered near the railroad tracks. Somehow, his death certificate survived. And we have that from the state archives. And he's listed here as John Smith, and his body was found the night of the lynching. Also in these records I obtained at the state archives, there was a letter where it seemed like State's Attorney Bailey was trying to get ahead of the news, and he wanted at least the state's Attorney General Lane to see that he was cooperating. And he let him know in this letter, he said, it was a message being relayed to him that we already got everything situated with the other black body we found, and pretty much, it's not connected. So he sends this ahead of time before he finds out about it. Again, Preston Lane, who I've had a love and hate relationship throughout this research. Then, as I looked at the questions, actually 2 days ago, as we prepared, to Dr. A.D. Brown, and in those questions, we have more evidence as to who this individual's identity is. As Dr. A.D. Brown identifies a black man who's in the vicinity of a white woman's home who is being chased by a mob. And so we're still investigating. I do believe, based on the support that this commission now has, and we're thankful for having the support of the Bureau of Justice Assistance and through the Emmett Till Cold Case Investigation Act, to identify this individual and to restore their honor and legacy. And with that, I believe I'm at time. So thank you all.
Thank you, Vice Chair Chavis, for that extensive work. My continued admiration and appreciation for you. the work of your team at George Mason, the work of our fellow commissioners in uncovering the totality of these stories. It's essential and it's necessary. So at this time, we are a little bit behind on time. Before we take our break and bring on Living and Growing, I do want to recognize Commissioner David Armenti, who serves as chair of our research committee for the MLTRC, who will provide a brief update regarding the ongoing research and investigation of racial terror lynchings in Wicomico County. Thank you, Commissioner Armenti.
Thank you, everyone. This has already been a very illuminating and powerful day, even for us as commissioners who have been embedded in the work. I certainly want to thank everybody for joining us today and taking that crucial step toward truth-telling and ultimately reconciliation that is our goal as a commission. Again, my name is David Armenti. I'm chair of the research committee, as well as Vice President of Education and Engagement at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. As a commission and a community, we intend to commemorate the lives of Garfield King, Matthew Williams, and the unknown victim found in the aftermath of the Williams murder, while supporting all efforts to document the crimes against them. Thank you to the many community members, researchers, collaborators, some of whom you've heard from today already, the Wicomico Truth and Reconciliation Initiative, the City of Salisbury Lynching Memorial Task Force, the Equal Justice Initiative, and the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project have laid the essential groundwork to allow additional documentation and visibility in our ongoing work. Since the establishment of the State Commission in 2019, we have worked with an array of partners, including the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, its local affiliates, George Mason University, Heritage Associates, a local historical research and genealogy firm, have also joined the team as a contracted collaborator of the MLTRC. I'd like to acknowledge and credit those who have been doing the work for years, including Sherilyn Eiffel, Linda Dyer, Dr. Charles Chavis, Will Schwartz, Professor George Shivers, Dr. Nicholas Creary, C. Christopher Brown, and others. And apologies, I can't list everybody, but we definitely want to emphasize that this is a collaborative and team effort, building on many, many folks' work. The Commission has attempted to build on the earlier work of the Maryland State Archives and the Edward H. Knabb Center at Salisbury University here in compiling and supporting digital access to newspaper articles, vital records, and secondary research accounts, but due especially to the breadth and depth of examination in Dr. Chavis's recent publication, The Silent Shore. The Commission's research task around that case has largely been corroborative, and as a commission, unlike existing databases, in our effort to better publicly acknowledge and make available, the Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission seeks to corroborate existing and future cases based on newspaper accounts, government records, family papers, and oral history interviews. Ancestry and other genealogical collections and platforms have also proven invaluable to gain further knowledge of the victims' families and background, while providing leads about possible living descendants, again, some of whom you've heard from today, who those connections were an outgrowth of the work of Dr. Chavis, our collaborators and students who have contributed to that effort. Collateral descendants of Garfield King have been contacted and consulted, for example, regarding that family history. Continued review of accounts from the Black press, most notably the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper and national publications, have also proven invaluable for expanding the narrative and interpretation. As many folks know, a lot of the earlier accounts of these crimes and murders were often leaning on white-dominated press such as the Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post, as well as the local newspapers and publications within the communities where the crimes occurred. It's our task to certainly expand beyond that and again make those more available to provide a counter-narrative, but also just a more full and complete narrative of the events as they occurred. This is particularly true for showing the humanity of the victims, as well as their family and fellow community members on whom the crimes often left indelible scars. The Research Committee and Heritage Associates have facilitated conversations with regional and local church offices and archives, as well as reviewed records at various repositories, including Princess Anne Academy, via Morgan State University, to provide fuller views of the lives of Garfield King, Matthew Williams, and others. We continue to work with the state, county, and local district agencies to locate relevant record collections, including but not limited to records and correspondence of Maryland governors and attorney generals, death certificates, and coroner's records. In some cases, existing retention and record management policies have posed problems for locating materials, and we appreciate the cooperation of colleagues in these pursuits. Dr. Chavis detailed some of those challenges as they relate to either unprocessed collections or record groups that are either mislabeled or not even known to exist within certain repositories. So we'll work to uncover and better document and record that information. For those records already identified by researchers and agencies, we seek to push for greater public accessibility through digitization and visibility via the Commission website and reporting. So that speaks to the ongoing task as the Commission continues its operations through the sunset period in 2024 to really pull together all of this research and records that have contributed to our greater understanding of these events. The Commission also seeks to connect with additional direct or collateral descendants of the victims, as well as contemporary community members who can provide us a more full view of the legacy and impact and can contribute to the historical record. This collaboration will continue with the community and extend for as long as the Commission is active. We welcome you to continue with us on that journey and reach out to us as commissioners, leadership in your community, as well as through the official Commission website and email address as well. That's mltrc@maryland.gov. Again, I want to thank everybody for taking your time out to attend and contribute to this historic moment, and reiterate again that this work goes on. We need all of you, and we will continue to do that work as long as we are tasked to do so and beyond. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Commissioner Armenti. Okay, we're good. All right. So before we have our 10-minute break, I would now like to bring up Living and Growing at this time to just provide their resources, their insight, and their expertise as we continue to process what we have listened to so far. Again, we want to acknowledge the healing aspect of this work. It's not just about sharing the truth, but there's real pain that has and continues to be felt because of this legacy. So this is our way, one of many ways, hopefully, to cultivate and encourage the healing of this and within this moment. So thank you, Dr. Combs.
Thank you. Hear me? Okay. So we're going to take a few minutes to really think about everything that we've just heard. And you can look at the floor or close your eyes, but seriously take it in. And then we're going to debrief by being able to take our hands when you're sitting, rub it down, and push that energy out of your legs, out of your knees, you know. Because what we've taken is a lot of painful information, important information, and we need to be able to work it through our bodies and our minds very well. And so when you breathe, when you take a deep breath, you want to open up your whole body. So you're going to breathe through your nose and make your stomach really fat. I mean, that's something we don't like doing, right? So push your body, make that stomach as fat as it can be, and you'll feel your body expand. So you're taking in a lot of oxygen to help to go to your brain and throughout your heart. And then you're going to let it out through your mouth and bring your stomach and try to have it smash to your back. So you're going to let it out. And so then you hold your stomach in very, very tight. Okay? So we'll do this about 3 to 5 really good times. Okay? So let's look down. You can close your eyes and look down and take a very large breath with your stomach going out. And then hold it. And then let it out. And that's letting out all those, any type of hurt, or sadness, pain. And take another one, big, make your stomach nice and fat, fill your whole body. And then very slowly, through your mouth, let it out, press your stomach to your back. And then the last time, take a big breath in, whole body, and then let it out. And then let's just sit here for a second. And let our body and minds talk. Just talk. And we can end. So what did that do for you guys? What did it do for anyone? Did it help to sort of like calm you down, or was it more agitating? What was it like for you? Found it calming? Okay. Calming so we can move on to the next part, so we can take in some more stuff, right? But for right now, we needed to like sort of get some of it out of us, and then in order to release a lot of it, so that we're now able to take more in. Okay? Okay.